Now let's take a look at Gizmo primitives and deformers. Here I've just got a fresh copy of Zbrush. I'm going to go to my tool palette and select the polymesh star and draw it on the canvas and then go into edit mode. The polymesh star kind of serves as a null object in Zbrush. It's just sitting at the origin and it's kind of a placeholder. I'm going to use this to create some primitives. I'll press W to bring up the gizmo. Now, the gizmo we've already talked about in a couple of videos. It basically allows you to move, scale, and rotate subtools independently of one another or as a group. However, it also has an added function here under the gear. Here you see we have the ability to create a variety of different primitives. So I'll begin by selecting a cylinder 3D. Now, here you see it's created a basically generic cylinder, and we've got these cones through here. These cones are modifiers. Here you see there's V divisions, so if I turn that up, I get divisions along V, and here I have divisions along H. So if I turn those up, I can increase the subdivisions. Here I actually have a radius for the center. I can make this a hollow pipe or leave it at 0 and make it a cylinder. Now, if I'm happy with this, I'll just press the W key, and that brings me back into the gizmo. If I go to the gear again, you see I have a variety of different modifiers here. I'm going to scale this along the Z-axis. And then let's open up our modifiers, and let's go to Bend Curve. Now, all these modifiers function basically the same way. You'll have a bounding box, you'll have dots, which are basically handles for the manipulator, and a variety of cones, which will affect different parameters. So in this case, I have the axis. Currently, it's set to 1, and you see 1 equals the x-axis, 2 equals y, and 3 equals z. So if I turn that up to 3, you see my bend axis is going down the z-axis. Now I can turn on symmetrical. Right now it's set to 0, but I'll turn it up to 1 for yes. And then if we mouse over the white cone here, there is smoothness, and the orange cone is the curve resolution. I'm going to turn this up so I have more dots, more handles along that axis. Now if I click on one of these points here, I can move these points affecting a bend. And each point you see also has modifiers. I've got a scale modifier here. I can turn that up or down. I have a squeeze modifier where I can squeeze this. And then I also have a twist modifier where I can actually twist this endpoint. And I have X symmetry, or excuse me, I have Z symmetry turned on. So you see as I move this point, the other point moves as well. So I can bend this one and then bend this one. I can again twist, scale, or squeeze. Back here, I still have symmetrical. I can turn that on and off. I still have my axis. I could change my axis if I wanted to, but I probably wouldn't want to at this stage since I've already started making my changes. Then I have smoothness. If I turn smoothness up and down, I can affect the smoothness of the bend. So let's move this over so we can actually see that. Bring this over and adjust the smooth. Increase the resolution along the curve, and smooth. Now, if I'm happy with this, I've got this button here, this curve here, this cone here, smooth. If I turn that up, it'll actually smooth the transition between each one of those points. And then if I click the gear icon, I can accept, reset, full reset, or delete. I'm going to accept, and that accepts that deformation. I have now actually baked that deformation down into that object. I can add a subdivision level if I like to smooth it down further. And there we go. Now whenever I'm working with the gizmo, if I hold down Control, Shift, click and drag, actually I need to step down a subdivision level and delete my higher. This only works if you have one subdivision level. While I'm in the gizmo, if I Control, Shift, click and drag, it will duplicate this object. Now it's not duplicating it and making it a separate subtool. It's still within the same subtool. It's just a duplicate. So I basically have these two meshes together in one subtool. So let's do another one now. I will duplicate this subtool, go to my gizmo, and now let's create a polycube. There we go. And go to the gizmo here, and let's reset it so we snap it back to its original position. Put it at the home point, and let's bring it up here. Turn off visibility on our previous one. Now, I will go to the polycube options, and this allows me to change the parameters of the polycube. I can increase the resolution in each axis here. and then I can go back to my deformers. Another very interesting deformer is project primitive. Project primitive will project a primitive shape into another primitive. So here the gizmo is affecting the primitive itself. So if I bring this up, you can see it's a sphere that's being projected. Now if I bring it just outside of the square, it becomes a recess. If I bring it back down, it becomes a sphere. Now these white dots allow me to shear the effect of that primitive, so I can slice parts of that off. Of course, I can scale it, rotate it, do whatever with this gizmo. Now, here we have another set of cones. We have blend, so if I turn blend up, I can change the way it blends into the underlying mesh. I can turn on new surface, which creates a new surface from this, and I have accept. So these will basically bake the effect, so I don't quite want to do these just yet. Over here, we have another set. This is T symmetry, or excuse me, Y symmetry, radial symmetry, and X symmetry. So if I turn radial symmetry on and move this off, let's turn on that radial symmetry again. There we go. We have to turn on another axis, and we'll scale this down, bring it down, and then move it out. And you see we have a radial symmetry here. If I turn down my radial symmetry count, there we go. You see we actually get a series of these projected primitives. Now over here, I have Y opacity. I can turn up and down the Y opacity, which effectively sort of clips the effect. Z opacity and X opacity. I have tessellate, which will affect the tessellation of the mesh. So if I turn this up or down, it affects just how dense that projected primitive is, and thus how smooth it is. Maximum displacement. Now I can adjust this, again, to sort of clip that effect. I can turn the volume essentially up and down on that projection. Opacity is another kind of volume control. You see it's basically limiting the impact of that projection. And then apply changes. So if I click this, it will apply that, and now that has actually been applied to the mesh. So let's come over here. We have accept. We've just accepted that change. So I clicked and dragged the accept. That accepts that change, and now I can move my projected primitive, and the previous projected primitive is still there, but I can change this projected primitive. If I'm happy with that, I'll accept it, and then I will move this one in. And let's change our radial symmetry count. Make that smaller. Move that in. And let's turn that up. So those are going inside rather than out. There we go. And now let's adjust our primitive type. Here we have primitive axis, primitive type, and the last cone here is modifier. So if I adjust the modifier, I can change the shape. If I turn that down, I basically make them more square. And if I adjust my primitive type here, I can change from sphere, triangle, cube. There's a variety of different primitives that I can choose from here. If I turn it up to here and then move it up, down, let's get that back. There we are. So we get an entirely different type of shape here. And then when I'm happy with that, I just click accept, and that now accepts that. So if I'm happy with this, I click the gizmo and click accept, and now that has been baked into that geometry. Here you see that this is actually part of that polymesh. Now, project primitive is very, very useful. I like using this to create greebles or little mechanical details on things, little repeating forms, just things that help give an object more of a sense of complexity and use, especially if you're trying to do like a spaceship or a piece of mech or tech. It's nice to have these sort of repeating mechanical forms because it just adds a sense of veracity or realism to the object. I'm going to append a polymesh star in and select that one. Go back to my gizmo and let's change to a different primitive now. Let's go to a polycube once again. Go to our modifiers, and bend arc and bend curve are essentially the same. Bend uses an arc and curve uses a curve. Bevel is quite nice. So if we go to bevel, you see what we're getting here is actually a bevel on all of our edges. I can adjust the size of the bevel with this slider here. I can adjust the resolution of it. and I can adjust the crease angle. So this is actually very nice. Again, whenever you're creating mech or hard surface pieces, it's always nice to avoid having a perfectly 90-degree edge. It's good to add a bevel to those edges so it catches light in a more realistic way. Now, as we move through here, we have various other deformers which are quite nice. There is the deformer, and the deformer is basically like a lattice. If I click these points, I can freeform distort the mesh, creating some very, very interesting effects. Once again, we have the series of cones here, which are controllers. We have the divisions along X, the divisions along Y and Z. Here we have, let's move over here so we can actually see that. Here we have the smoothness. So if I turn up the smoothness or turn down the smoothness, it will impact the smoothness of that transition. And we have symmetry as well. So we can do parallel symmetry or mirror symmetry. So if I turn on symmetry and then grab these points again, there you go. You see that actually mirrors that lattice symmetrically. And as always, if I'm happy with the piece and I want to keep it, I just press the gear and click Accept, or I can click Reset, and that will reset those settings and allow me to go back and change them. Going back to the gear, we can access the rest of our deformers here. Flatten is a particularly nice one. Flatten, you use these cones to actually flatten portions of the mesh. So let's change this primitive now to a polysphere. Let's turn up our resolution, and then let's go to flatten. And now if I use these cones, I can slice off portions, and then go to our cones here, and I can adjust my symmetry. So if I want symmetry, I can turn that on along each axis. So if I turn it on the x-axis, I am mirroring across the x-axis, and along the z-axis, I am mirroring along the z-axis, like so. So then if I make further changes, it will continue to mirror. Accept, and then we are done. Now we have various others. We have already seen project primitive. We can come down here to taper. Taper is a particularly nice one. Basically, it utilizes the same technique with these orange curves. I can taper down various angles of the mesh here. So if I want to mirror that, that's our opacity, excuse me. Here we go. There's our exponent. If I turn my exponent up and down, I can adjust the fall off of that taper. There's my opacity X, Y, and Z. And there we go. We can reset that now. We get back to our original shape. Twist is another very nice one. Twist will twist along the axis that you actually select. So I can take this and twist it, which is a great way to create something like, for example, a drill bit or a spiral staircase or any type of twisted organic form. I quite like this modifier and use it a lot to create sort of interesting shapes. I can actually negative twist that one. On the positive twist on that, we get a very, very neat kind of shape here. Hit the gizmo gear and click Accept, and that is now baked down as part of the geometry. Now we also have the extender. The extender actually works best if we go back to a cube. It'll be a lot more clear if you see this with a cube. If I go to my deformers and I select extender, the extender, if I take the orange circle here, I can actually expand essentially this shape. So I'm extending it along this axis, and here I've got the X size. I can change the size after my extension. Here, you see I've got the size and the extender for each axis. And then down here I have resolution. So if I turn up my resolution, I can increase the resolution of that transitional area. So again, this is really nice for going in and creating interesting extrusions and complex forms. I also have an inflate slider here where I can inflate that effectively if I wanted to create like a banding around an object. I can do that using the extender with inflate. If I'm happy with that, let's accept it. And then we can go back to our deformers and go to bevel. And then we can bevel those shapes, giving us a nice sort of transitional bevel on each edge, and accept that. Now there's a variety of other deformers in here, and they all essentially follow the same general idea. You're always going to have a series of cones that will affect all of the various parameters for your effect. So here I'm on multi-slice. So you see I've got apply creasing, it's set to 0. We'll leave it at that. Here I've got my center. I'll leave the center point as it is. And we've got X resolution, Y resolution, and Z resolution. And then the colored cones here, we have slice width. We have slice, oops, there we go. We have slice width in each axis. Like so, and then we grab this. Let's go to frame mode so we can actually see what we're doing here. There we go. There's our slice. And let's turn our resolution up, or width up, I mean. There we go. Let's turn our resolution down. And there you are. So we're basically creating a slice through the mesh, and you notice each plane gets its own polygroup. I can do another one in a different axis here. There we go. If I want to move that center point, I can do that, and I can move that slice along the length of the object. Turn my resolution down. Turn my width up. When I'm happy with that, click the gear and accept those changes. So these deformers are a great way to go in and create interesting new forms, especially if you're trying to create greebles, which are just little hard surface detail pieces, insert mesh brushes. If you watch the Boolean chapter, we're going to use these deformers to create a knife. We're going to use taper and scale and create a knife blade, and then use Booleans and primitives to actually create a complex sort of hunting knife. So it's a very powerful tool that's actually nested down inside the interface. It works really nicely as well with the ZModeler tools because it does polygroup as you go. So for example, if I go to B for brush, Z for ZModeler, and select my ZModeler brush, I'm going to click OK on dynamic draw size. Now, if you have not seen the video on ZModeler yet, go ahead and take a look at that. But just as a quick example, if I press the space bar here, I'm going to use QMesh as my modeling tool. My target, I'm going to do polygroup island. And then we'll leave the modifiers as they are. So what will happen here is if I click and drag, oops. Let's zoom in here so we actually can grab a face. If I click and drag on one of these faces, it's going to extrude everything from that particular polygroup. So it's actually really nice that it does this polygrouping. It makes life quite a bit easier and helps you create even more interesting variations on what you've been working on, simply because it's been organizing your mesh as you go. So polygroups, again, are very, very helpful. Indispensable, I would say, especially when you're getting into ZModeler and hard surface. They're going to come into play and be very, very important. So I press the W key again. That brings back my gizmo. Press the gear, and then I can see my primitives and my deformers once again. So hopefully you found this helpful. Go ahead and give an exploration of all these different deformers, and you see that essentially they behave very consistently. You're going to have a series of cones to change your parameters, and when you're happy with your work, simply return to the gizmo gear icon and click accept to bake those changes down. So hopefully you found this video helpful. Again, for more information on deformers and seeing them used in action, watch the Boolean tutorial where we use them extensively to create a knife blade. So thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.